Good morning, Hayes Hills folks. We are in Second Kings chapter 11. Let's start with verse 1. Now, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, the sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being put to death. She put him in his nurse in a bedroom. Thus they hid him from Athaliah, so that he was not put to death. And he remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. This is a pretty momentous time when the line of David in Judah was broken. For 6 years, a non Davidic heir reigned over Judah. This is the southern kingdom. The northern kingdoms already had their warfare with Jehu destroying the house of Ahab. Athaliah is the last remaining person associated with the house of Ahab. She is Ahab and Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah. She married Jehoram, the king of Judah, and encouraged him really to do evil things to bring back Baal worship. It was under Jehoram that Baal worship really got reestablished in Judah. If you remember, way back under Rehoboam, the first king after Solomon, there was already Baal worship and Asherah worship that God judged. So Athaliah hears that her son, who'd only reigned 1 year, had been killed. Remember, he went down with his uncle Jehoram in the south and the north and helped with the battle at Ramoth Gilead. But his uncle was wounded, and so during a break in the war, he went and visited his uncle as he recovered there in Jezreel, and they came across Jehu, who came to kill them, and he assassinated the king Jehoram in the north, and he wounded and finally assassinated this king from Judah, Ahaziah. He was wicked also for his 1 year that he reigned. So you have the queen mother. The queen mother had some powers traditionally, and apparently here she had some powers. There was a vacuum. There was no king. Her son was killed. She heard that no king had been put in his place. He had some brothers and other relatives. You know, the house of the Judahite kings had been kind of um, destroyed virtually under Jehoram. His brothers were all killed when he took the throne. He killed them to get their wealth. The father Josaphat left them, but Joram had sons, and sons before he became king, and maybe while he was king. A number of sons from different women. We is implied. So here's Athaliah, and she's the queen mother, and she knows she's going to lose any authority that she has if another king takes place. She's the queen mother, and she would rather keep her power. She has one opportunity to keep her power. So, being a very forceful person like her mother Jezebel, she immediately orders the killing, her trusted military people that she had probably ingrained herself with. She got them to kill all the other possible claimants to the throne of Judah. She had them all killed so she could reign, and she reigned for 6 years. For 6 years, Judah had a non-Davidic heir. She was married to a Davidic heir, Jehoram, but she was not. She was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. She was an imposter, really, from the north, coming down to be the queen mother and now reigning. She's not even considered a king or queen. She's not counted in normal biblical languages. The normal formula given for her reign is not given in Second Kings. So she wasn't even considered legitimate. But she reigned over the land. It was a terrible time, those 6 years. I mean, her husband had already brought in Baal worship and her son for his 1 year. She really reinforces Baal worship. She establishes a temple to Baal in Jerusalem, of all places. The temple of Baal in Jerusalem, if you can imagine that. And we also know from Second Chronicles that she and her son before her had raided the temple of the Lord and used some of the elements, taking them to service in the temple of Baal, taking some of the golden items that were used, the utensils for worship. So the temple of the Lord was pretty much unused and was wrecked. It was kind of destroyed by this wicked woman and her associates. So the sister of Jehoram, the half sister of Jehoram, knows about her nephew. He's an infant. He's 1 year old. He's the son of Ahaziah. Ahaziah is not a righteous king, but he's in the line of David. And his son, Joash or Jehoash, there's two different ways of saying it. He's 1 year old, and so his half sister takes him and hides him from the slaughter of all his brothers and other relatives who could claim the throne. So who is this woman, Jehosheba? She's not the daughter of Athaliah. This woman, Jehosheba, is the daughter of Joram, but not the daughter of Athaliah. She had a different mother. And she was a godly woman, apparently. And she was married to the high priest. We learned that in Second Chronicles. She's married to the high priest, who was a righteous man. And she hid this little child from the slaughter. This one little child was the last Davidic heir alive because of the destruction previously. We heard of the brothers of Ahaziah being killed by the Arabs and the Philistines and so on and so forth. So this is the last heir to the throne from the line of David. And he was almost put to death. She escapes with him. She hides him in, it says, in a bed chamber, which is where the beds, mattresses, linens were stored and brought out for summer or winter. She hid him there with his nurse. He had a wet nurse. And then a little later on, she hid him in the temple. We know that from Second Chronicles. He was hidden in the temple. We see that right there in verse 3. So this woman was married to the high priest. It was easy for her to somehow sneak this child over to the temple where Athaliah would never go. Athaliah did not honor the Lord. She did not worship the Lord. Even though Yahweh worship was still officially the worship of the land, she was a Baal worshiper. She wouldn't go to the temple. And so this little boy, Joash, was raised in the temple quarters. There was rooms off the temple where the priest lived. And he was hidden there and raised there under the influence of the high priest, taught the law. So this is a narrow escape is taking place of the Davidic line. Verse 4, but in the 7th year of Jehoiada, that's the high priest, he sent and brought the captains of the Carites and of the guards and had them come to him in the house of the Lord. And he made a covenant with them, and he put them under oath in the house of the Lord, and he showed them the king's son. That had to be shocking. There was a son alive after 6 years of Athaliah's reign. No one knew, except for the high priest and this daughter of Jehoram and some others. No one knew that there was a descendant of David alive. And he commanded them, this is the thing that you shall do. 1/3 of you, those who come off duty on the Sabbath and guard the king's house, another third being at the gate of Sur, and a third at the gate of the guards, shall guard the palace. And the 2 divisions of you which come on duty in force on the Sabbath and guard the house of the Lord on behalf of the king shall surround the king, that's the new king, each with his weapons in his hand, and whoever approaches the ranks is to be put to death. Be with the king when he goes out and when he comes in. So basically, the high priest takes charge. He's waiting for this boy to be old enough to even sit on the throne. And he waits 6 years, so the little boy is 7 years old now. And he makes a plan. There's the traditional guard for the temple and guard for the king's palace. And there was a shift change. And it was on the Sabbath, and for some reason on the Sabbath, there was a double a number of guards over the temple on the Sabbath, so he could kind of disguise the coup d'etat that he's about to engineer by getting those going off duty to stay on duty. There would be this changing of the guard, and you'd have both groups there at one time. Then one group would retire and leave for their shift. So he picked a time when the most guards would be there at one time, and he worked with their leaders, who apparently were righteous leaders who respected Yahweh and hated Athaliah, and he engineered with them, he conspired with them that they would stay and be ready to guard the new king and be ready to guard the palace in case the queen tried to kill the little boy. She'd already killed other boys, other men, other claimants to the throne. We don't know who in verse 4 the Karaites are exactly. They may be a mercenary group. Could be they're specialized, kind of like in you have the Pope is guarded by the Swedish Guard, right? Something like that. Kind of a special, almost ceremonial guard. And so he engineers this plot where all of these guards will be on duty at the same time, no one going off duty, and that's when he would present the new king. Verse 9, the captains did according to all that Jehoiada, the priest, commanded, and they each brought his men who were to go off duty on the Sabbath with those who were come on duty on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada, the priest. So the day was set, and on that day, on that Sabbath, they came in large numbers to do what the high priest wanted. Excuse me. And the priests gave to the captains the spears and shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of the Lord. And the guards stood, every man with his weapon in his hands, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, around the altar, and the house on behalf of the king. Then he brought out the king's son and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony, and they proclaimed him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king." There may have been other citizens who were invited as well to see this. And so on the appointed day, they crowned this little 7-year-old king. And they were guarding. This is the temple proper, but this would be the altar. Remember, it's not inside the temple building, but it's in the temple proper. It's in the courtyards of the temple. It's in front of the temple, there with the laver, and that's where they presented the king. Apparently, it was a traditional place for a king to be crowned, to be the coronation. And it could be that it says there in verse was it 10 that they had guards everywhere. They just filled the temple courtyard area and had the king standing here. And then verse 13, when Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. So she didn't go literally in the house. The temple was considered the whole courtyard area. And when she looked, there was the king standing by the pillar according to the custom, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason, treason!" Then Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains who were set over the army, "Bring her out between the ranks and put to death with the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest said, "Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord." So they laid hands on her, and she went through the horses' entrance to the king's house, and there she was put to death. So basically, we see when it says that the king was standing by the pillar, many scholars believe that it was a kind of raised area. He's 7 years old. You couldn't see him with all those soldiers surrounding him. So this raised pillar, there he was, and he had a crown, and he had the covenant. That means he had the testimony, he had the laws. In Deuteronomy 17, God had required that kings have their own copy of the laws and that they copy it by hand themselves in order to be familiar with the law and to know the law. And there was to be a covenant cut, literally a covenant was cut between God and the people, between the people and the king, We see this in the Old Testament. We see David cutting this covenant with the people, the elders of the people, Solomon cutting this covenant to, to, to promise not to oppress the people, to promise to keep God's rule near, to promise to be a king in the righteousness of the Lord and not like other kings. And so I'm trying to see where I stopped here. Um, and so they brought the king out, verse 12. They put a crown on him, and they gave him the testimony. That would be the copy of the law. That's what the kings were required to have in the copy. And they proclaimed him, and then they anointed him. So kings were anointed, priests were anointed, prophets were often anointed. That's where we get Jesus as prophet, priest, and king, those three offices. And they clapped their hands and said, "Long live the king." So the queen heard this. Her home, the palace, is right next to the temple, right? The temple, which was unused, I mean, barely used, barely kept up by the priest, just kind of a ceremonial going through the motions. But Baal worship had really taken hold of Jerusalem, and she had everyone fearful of not following her. She was wicked like Jezebel. She was a terribly wicked, idolatrous woman, and she hears the rejoicing going on. She hears the shouts next door. So she goes with her, I'm sure, some of her aides immediately and guards to go see what the commotion was about. And she sees suddenly one of her grandsons. One of her grandsons, uh, and who has been missing. She probably realized he was missing at some point. She had to have some count of who was killed, and she knew he was missing, probably presumed dead. And suddenly, you imagine the shock, how it dawned on her suddenly seeing this little boy and recognizing that he is the son of her son Ahaziah. And she cries, "Treason, treason." Well, everything she did was treason, right? Against the house of David, the line of David. She's an imposter, but she's hoping somebody will come to her aid. Of course, no one does. And so they put her to death, not in the temple, because that would bloody and desecrate the temple, but they take her out to a gate that's where the horses enter into the palace. So, the temple and the palace are right next to each other. So it was very close, short walk. Doesn't that kind of remind you of Jezebel? She was trampled by horses, and here Jezebel's daughter, the evil Athaliah, who had killed so many people in order to get power, she is killed where the horses would come through. Kind of a similar fate. Let's see, what else am I going to say? Well, they blew the trumpets, and she ripped her robes as a sign of of outrage, and they put her to death. And these people, these guards, apparently were fearful of Athaliah, but when they saw the high priest take charge and they saw that a king was alive, an actual son of David, an actual descendant of David, you imagine how patriotic that was to suddenly realize there was a person in the line of David still alive. They didn't know that for 6 years. To see him and to have the high priest prepared to anoint him as king, and then to be given the actual weapons David used to get out these old weapons from a few hundred years before. This is like God bless America. This is a very patriotic moment. Imagine the pride that suddenly they're able to be a part of this patriotic coup. And in verse 17, and Jehoiada cut a covenant. He made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. So this is kind of a complicated covenant. It's three-way between the Lord and the king and the people, and between the king and the people, where he promised not to oppress them. They had to have this new covenant because Baal worship had interceded, and they had lost Yahweh worship, or they'd lost their exclusive worship of Yahweh, the Lord. And so we see that the new covenant had to be made in order to get the people back on track of worshiping the Lord. And then verse 18, then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down, his altars and his images they broke in pieces. And they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars, and the priest posted watchmen over the house of the Lord. And he took the captains, the Kerites, there's that word again, we're not sure what it means exactly, the guards and all the people of the land. And they brought the king down from the house of the Lord, marching through the gate of the guards to the king's house. And he took his seat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword at the king's house. Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. He's going to reign 40 years. We're going to learn a lot more about him next chapter. But this temple to Baal had been raised up by Joram, the husband of Athaliah, under her influence, and raised, I'm sure, supported by Athaliah during her 6 years. This high priest of Baal, Mattan, that's a Phoenician name. He was imported because Phoenicia was the headquarters of Baal worship. And the crowd, this is bigger than Jehu's reform in the north. Remember Jehu, they destroyed the temple of Baal and killed all those Baal leading worshipers. But here it seems to be more of a popular uprising. The people go spontaneously when Yahweh worship is reestablished and a covenant is cut between the Lord and the people and the king in David's line. What a patriotic moment that was to realize that David's line, the promises God made to David in 2 Samuel 7, where he promised one would reign on his throne, David's line would reign forever. It was restored. The line of David was restored. The promise to David, which they thought was lost. You can imagine how discouraged and depressed they were under Athaliah. And so, what a tremendous moment and momentum. Now that God's promises have been restored, they went out and destroyed the temple of Baal, killing the high priest, presumably others. And they brought the king from the temple to the palace. See, they probably cleansed the palace of all Athaliah's idolatry and sat him on the throne so he could officially be on the throne. Of course, he was under the tutelage of the high priest who taught him God's law. And as long as the high priest lived, Joash, this king, was a righteous king. He was a good and righteous king. Things fell apart when the high priest died. So that tells us something about the need for our children to internalize what we teach them and to experience for themselves the promises of God and the goodness of God. And so he reigned. He's going to reign 40 years. We're going to read more about that next week. So that's kind of our lesson today. I'm sorry to have to kind of rush that. Other reading you might do would be Second Chronicles. It gives you kind of the same events with slightly different details. We're given names we're not given in this chapter. Second Chronicles 22 and 23 is where you might want to read just to give some more details. Some things we learn in Second Chronicles that Athaliah and her sons, not from the house of David, but her sons from someone else, she broke down the house of God, left it in disrepair, misused parts of the house of the Lord for the worship of Baal. She was a wicked, wicked woman. So this is a tremendous reform, this tremendous return to the Lord that's going to happen here, and God saves the line of David miraculously. You see the line of David, we see it in the garden, that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the seed of the serpent. And we see that this seed is to come through David's line, and the Messiah, Jesus, is that seed. And we see, remember in Revelations, you have the woman in great travail and pregnancy about to give birth, and there's this dragon that's going to want to devour the child, but she is made to escape to the wilderness. That represents Israel, who gives birth. Israel gives birth to this Messiah. And so we see in Revelations the dramatic imagery there. This is part of the actual history of the seed surviving the attempts of Satan to destroy the seed that would bring about the Messiah. God saves the line to the Messiah. He saves our hopes for salvation. Let us pray. Father, thank you for this time in your word. We ask, God, you bless the lessons from this word, the need for us to hate idolatry, to teach our children, and to demonstrate to our children a love for you, and worship of you, in all that we do, all of our priorities, to put you first. We see the consequences of not putting you first. And we see Satan working through Athaliah. We see that he is one who robs us of joy and discourages us. And he does attack the house of God, he attacks Christians. And so help us, Father, to help us to let your Holy Spirit cause our temple, our church, and our personal lives to be dedicated to you and cleansed of idolatry. For it's in Christ's name I pray. Amen. All right. Thank you so much. God bless you.